Okay, we will go on the record. And before we go on the record, if you could please ensure that your microphone's on mute. I'm hearing some feedback. Okay, we're going on the record at this point. Good morning and welcome to the Maryland Public Service Commission. This is our fourth public educational session in docket RM 9665, where we're examining Maryland's distribution system planning processes. Our first three sessions focused on the basics of distribution system planning and the existing processes used by our state's 5 largest utilities. Today, we will hear from the state agencies and environmental advocates. While the realities of the utility systems will drive much of the conversation in this docket, the perspective of the voices provide an incredibly valuable counterpoint. We'll soon hear from the technical staff of the Commission, the state's residential ratepayer advocate, the state's energy office, and national environmental groups. Today's session is intended to provide the Commission and the workgroup membership with an introduction to these organizations, and they will share their perspectives on how the distribution system planning process can be improved. This workshop today is an opportunity for exchange without arguing specific outcomes, although I could assure every participant that there will be plenty of time for both advocacy within the workgroup and before the Commission. Finally, I would like to introduce our new workgroup leadership, Ms. Stephanie Vavro with Silver Point Consulting and Mr. John Marceski with EN Engineering. They both have 35 years of experience in the industry, and moving forward, they will be organizing and leading our workgroup discussions. So we are very excited to have their leadership to guide this important process over the course of this year, and they will have the chance to introduce themselves personally at their team's first plenary session of the workgroup. Today's workshop will begin with a presentation by our technical staff, followed by the Office of People's Counsel, the Maryland Energy Administration, and then we'll conclude with the perspective and presentation of Earth Justice. Over the course of this workshop, the commissioners may ask questions as we go, and they'll have an opportunity to also ask questions after each of the 4 presentations. And then finally, at the conclusion of this workshop, we will end this YouTube live stream. We'll take a 10-minute break where the commissioners will depart, and then Ms. Knoll and Ms. Vavro will lead the stakeholder question portion of this discussion, which will not be live streamed. With that, if my colleagues do not have any opening comments, I will turn it over to Commission staff for their presentation. Good morning, Mr. Borkowski. Mr. Borkowski, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. I just couldn't find the right control. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, sir. Although it looks like we're having some trouble pulling up your presentation. Oh, there it is.
Okay. Okay, well, with technical difficulties aside, good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. John Borkowski for Commission Technical Staff. And thank you for the opportunity to present today at the Distribution System Planning Educational Session number 4. Ms. Vavro asked all the presenters today to provide a brief level-setting presentation on each agency's statutory mission, the interests that each agency represents, and also other thoughts on distribution system planning. So I felt like I would focus on Maryland regulated rate statutes, and I just want to highlight a couple. Section 3-112, burden of proof requirements. The statute says that burden of proof is on the proponent of a new rate or change in rate. And to the extent that distribution system planning will be developing projects that will be reviewed for prudency and rate case, this argues for transparency, the need for transparency to meet those burden of proof requirements. Also, Section 4101, just and reasonable rates. Our agency needs to consider rate cases and determining rates that are consistent with the public good, but also provide a reasonable return for the proponent of a new rate. And finally, I'd like to just highlight Section 7505, which established multi-year rate plans in statute. And in establishing the multi-year rate plan pilot, the Commission Order number 89482 states that providing sufficient data on planned capital spending at the following stage of a multi-year rate plan is essential to allowing transparency into the utilities planning process, which the Commission identified as a key benefit of a multi-year rate plan. I'd just like to highlight in that statement the terms sufficient data and the term utility planning process. So regarding our experience to date with multi-year rate plans, in the BGE multi-year rate plan pilot, which was in case 9645, and also in the PEPCO multi-year rate plan case number 9655, both staff and other stakeholders expressed concern about insufficient information, particularly insufficient quantitative benefits and also insufficient forecast information regarding things like forecast for cost, even the explanations of the changes in cost from historical cost, forecast for billing determinants, forecast for load demand that was driving certain projects for capacity expansion, et cetera. And not having sufficient information makes prudence reviews and reconciliation challenging and shifts the burden of proof from the company to interveners. And specifically in order number 89678, the Commission, this is the BG rate case, multi-year plan rate case, the Commission did express some concerns with regards to transparency, citing the challenge that insufficient information poses on prudency reviews and reconciliation. And although I don't have it on this slide, I will note that in the PEPCO multi-year rate case, similar sentiments were expressed. And I'd like to just read that for a second. Paragraph 206 on page 85 in the PEPCO rate case order number 89868 states that the adoption of multi-year rate plans has altered the rate-making landscape by allowing greater visibility into utility planning processes and increasing stakeholder engagement. The Commission will carefully scrutinize decisions made by utilities, especially for capital projects that runs into the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, and the Commission is well aware of and concerned with the information asymmetries that have hampered stakeholder input into system planning in the past. And the Commission further states in that same paragraph that hopefully the work of the recently launched Distribution System Planning Work Group under PC 44 will help resolve these transparency concerns and aid in deeper reviews of system investment decisions during prudency reviews. So lastly, I'd like to also say due to the insufficient information, OPC did request a stakeholder engaged distribution planning process be initiated during the BGE rate case, but the Commission deferred that until after the NARUC NASIO task force report on comprehensive electricity planning. So I'd like to just talk about that task force for a couple minutes. The Neighborhood NASIO Task Force on Comprehensive Electricity Planning finished its report in February 2021, and they issued a blueprint for state action stating 5 aligned distribution planning benefits, namely to improve reliability and resilience, to optimize the use of DERs, to avoid unnecessary costs to ratepayers, support state policy priorities, and also increase transparency of grid-related investment decisions. Staff, furthermore, at the technical conference on March 25th, 2021, proposed a couple of starting points for consideration of the distribution planning initiative. And the first was about considering the locational value of DERs in planning. DERs can provide significant benefits to the grid by controlling or reducing electricity consumption or generating electricity, thereby allowing the avoidance of some electric system costs, particularly with respect to capacity expansion. The potential value of a DER at a specific location on the grid is determined by the capability of that DER and the potential costs it can avoid at that location. We also propose that one of the starting points be to develop a framework to evaluate and utilize non-wire alternatives. Now, a DER that's being used to support the electric grid by offsetting a traditional wires type capacity investment is known as a non-wire alternative. And non-wire alternatives are particularly valuable with regards to resiliency, because these when these NWAs are DERs that are closer to the load, they can provide resiliency solutions that are less reliant on vulnerable distribution infrastructure. So solutions closer to the load are desirable, even with a hardened utility system, especially during major storm outage events. Staff also proposed that a starting point be to determine value streams for these DERs and cost recovery. To be clear, to be economically viable, many DERs rely on capturing not only locational value for capacity expansion deferral, that would be something that would be looked at actively in a distribution system planning initiative, but they also provide other value streams such as bulk power system capacity, energy, various ancillary services at PJM. And this dual market participation requires alignment and coordination to capture multiple or stacked value streams. And lastly, staff proposed some level of coordination among Maryland's various grid modernization proceedings. And I have that as an example on my last slide here this morning. I just want to note the Interconnection work group, which I lead. This is not to say that there aren't a lot of other grid modernization activities going on that are important, but as an example, I chose the Interconnection work group. I view the Interconnection work group as providing the tools to be able to remove obstacles to help interconnect DERs, whereas I view the distribution system planning initiative to be an initiative on, how to use those tools, how to use DERs to achieve distribution system planning objectives, as I talked about on a previous slide. So to that end, the Interconnection work group is working on things like a smart inverter requirement, which I'll talk about in a second, but also getting into a lot of planning related concepts regarding hosting capacity. It's important to recognize that distribution systems were not designed for two-way power flow. And in fact, they reach a lot of technical limitations with reverse power flow. So to that extent, hosting capacity is the ability to accommodate the interconnection of DERs. It's a measure of how many DERs can be interconnected before an upgrade is needed. If you don't have enough hosting capacity, you have something which we call a closed circuit. We've codified that in COMAR with our interconnection work group. So a closed circuit is an area of the electric distribution system that in order to facilitate more DERs, you need to open it, and you would need an upgrade project. We also codified something that touches on planning concepts called restricted circuits and reserve hosting capacity. We did not like the idea that, you know, a simple rooftop solar type project, for instance, would not be able to interconnect because it would be, you know, that first mover DER that causes that upgrade, and you know, a small rooftop solar system is very unlikely to be able to afford, you know, the cost of an expensive interconnection upgrade. So we developed a concept called restricted circuits where you would reserve hosting capacity for these smaller DERs, typically less than 20 kilowatts. But that relies on DER forecasting, which forecasting is really a planning concept. So we didn't really give guidance in our work group on how the utilities specifically should forecast DERs in the future, but we did allow utilities in COMAR to restrict circuits and to reserve hosting capacity, so we wouldn't block you know, some of these smaller DERs from interconnecting. We also had various regulations around hosting capacity reporting. I'm happy to say that we have 3 companies in Maryland, BGE, Pepco, and Delmarva, that all have hosting capacity maps that are out there online. And we also work with hosting capacity cost allocation methodology. We're continuing to work on that because that cause or pays methodology that we have now, where the first mover DER that interconnects, that causes an upgrade, has to pay 100% of the upgrade cost. That is an obstacle to interconnection, particularly if that DER is not using all of the upgrade capacity that's created from the upgrade project. So for instance, you know, if a DER interconnects in an upgrade project, is proposed that, you know, their DER, let's say hypothetically, is only using 25%. What we're working on is a methodology where that DER would only be allocated 25% of the upgrade. So getting into the distribution system planning arena, you know, the smart inverters that we talked about before, a requirement for for DERs at some point in the future to use smart inverters. This will enable DER grid services, such as I talked about on a previous slide, to unlock those different value streams to make these DERs more viable. We also talked about the concept of reserve hosting capacity. Of course, you need DER forecasting for that, but you also need DER forecasting for things like hosting capacity upgrade planning. For instance, when upgrade is created, what's the proper size of that upgrade? You really don't want to get in a situation where you put an upgrade in and then a year later you have to upgrade again. So you really need DER forecasting to work lockstep with your upgrade planning so that you put in the right size of upgrade. And that's all a planning initiative. It's not a interconnection work group initiative, but we have linkages. And to that end, there are a lot of stakeholders in my work group in particular that want to view DERs as assets. They want more than a piecemeal approach in that you just deal with each DER one at a time. And I'd like to look at planning more holistically to prepare the grid for DER integration. And indeed, we're even talking about this with the transmission note, or how do you plan, the grid for DERs at the transmission level? Well, we need to do this at the distribution level too. And lastly, another point of overlap between our work groups would be the hosting capacity calculation methods. We codified some concepts in the interconnection work group that rely on hosting capacity calculations, but we were not prescriptive with the utilities on how they calculated hosting capacity. So that's really more of a planning topic. So I'm hopeful that Distribution System Planning Initiative undertakes some reviews of hosting capacity calculation methods. And that concludes my presentation. And I yield my time back. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Borkowski. You just used the word holistically a moment ago, and I've noticed a number of other participants and workgroup memberships have used that word as well. But I think it accurately characterizes the challenge in the effort that lies before us, because, as you stated, we can unlock a lot of potential through addition of DERs to this grid, but we have to do it thoughtfully and step by step. That last slide that you also provided us with shows the high level of coordination that I believe the interconnection work group and the distribution system planning work group will have on a going forward basis. Tying in a DER that isn't well planned will only result in potential problems in the future. So I suspect you and workgroup leader Ms. Vivaro will be working closely together over the course of the next year. Thank you for that presentation. I'll turn to my colleagues if they have questions or comments of you. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Just one thought, Chief Borkowski, you being an engineer by trade and myself being a technician by initial trade, when you were having your technical difficulties up front, I suggested that maybe you needed the help of a technician.
Are you volunteering?
I think I've lost my skills, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Okay, Chief Borkowski, thank you to you. Thank you to your engineering department as well. I suspect we'll be putting the expertise of our commission staff engineers to the test as the distribution system planning work group kicks off into high gear.
Okay, thank you very much.
At this time, I'd like to recognize the Maryland Office of People's Counsel. They have a presentation to share with us as well. Good morning, Mr. Fields. Oh, Mr. Lapp, I didn't see you there. The People's Counsel is joining us. Good morning, Mr. Lapp.
Good morning, Chair Stanek. Thank you and all the commissioners for providing OPC a chance to present here this morning. I'm here with Deputy Counsel Bill Fields and Assistant People's Counsel Daria Pugh. We do applaud the commission for starting this proceeding. It presents a great opportunity to advance the interests of consumers and new technologies, and to ensure the grid furthers state environmental goals, especially climate change. And of course, to make sure that all these goals are achieved at the lowest possible cost. As much as anything, this proceeding should be about asking and answering fundamental questions. I wanted to highlight 3 of those big questions before turning it over to our consultants. The first big question is, what are the existing and emerging technologies that distribution planning should consider? We know that technology moves fast. We need to build the system for the smartphone, not the flip phone. Thinking ahead will avoid sinking costs into technologies that may become obsolete or duplicative. We need to consider the products and services that consumers and public policy will demand in the coming decades. They include microgrids, localized solar, vehicle-to-grid charging, energy management software, and other new and unforeseen technologies. For these products and services, we'll need to ask, will consumers be better off with a product or service being provided by a utility monopoly? Or will competition produce consumer benefits through lower prices and innovation? And for all those products that should be served competitively, how do we make competition work? What are the barriers to entry for competition to be effective? Barriers might include access to customers, access to customer information, system information, interconnection standards, system compatibility, and interoperability. The next big question is, who should be the players? Who are the players? We know consumers and utilities are players, but there's also aggregators, DER suppliers, providers, brokers, EV charging companies, software developers. For all these, we need to ask what should be their role in distribution planning. The third big question is, what should be the role of the utilities? Are they or should they be competitors as well? Enforcing impartiality is hard if the utilities are also competitors. Should they be competitively neutral, providing a platform that facilitates effective competition? Think about generation 30 or 40 years ago. And then we need to ask how we best regulate the utilities to ensure they perform in ways that benefit consumers and further our state's environmental policies. These questions and thoughtful analysis should serve as guideposts for all the distribution planning. System investments that can then be made incrementally as evidence shows that those investments will benefit consumers. Good planning will also help to avoid investments that technology and public policy make obsolete. The risk of sunk cost is significant. The expensive flip phones when smartphones are on the way. To help our office think about these issues, OPC's retained a team of experts. These individuals bring a wealth of experience in utility regulation, and specifically in utility distribution systems, DERs, and distribution planning. At the end of the upcoming slide deck, you can learn more about their experience. As this proceeding moves forward, I encourage you to consider a few thoughts from Daniel Kahneman, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics and the author of Thinking, Fast and Slow. Kahneman has done extensive work examining how people make decisions. There are two decision-making behaviors that Kahneman describes and come to mind as this proceeding moves forward. The first is the reference point instinct that leads us to defer heavily to the status quo. Here, the status quo means heavy dependence on the utility. The second is the halo effect. An example of this would be deferring to the utilities on aspects of distribution planning just because they may have improved their record on reliability. The animating principle in this distribution planning process should be to determine what is in the public interest. The utilities' plans and proposals will only be fully consistent with the public interest by coincidence. Today is a good initial step toward an open and transparent distribution planning process. We appreciate the Commission taking that step, and we look forward to contributing. I want to now turn it over to Ron Nelson of Stratagen for the rest of our presentation. Thank you.
Mr. Lapp, good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Am I being heard?
Yes, sir. We could hear you. If you could maximize your presentation, that'll help the visibility.
All right, I will let Mr. Fields see if he can
Did that help?
hear that.
That got us halfway there. If you could make it larger, that would be better for the viewers on YouTube. But if that's as big as we can get.
Yep, I will work on that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Nelson, if you'd like to proceed.
Yes, thank you. So today I'll be going over a framework for distribution system planning. You can go ahead and move to the Second slide, Mr. Fields. So I'm going to begin with talking about distribution grid evolution. Many of us understand many of the changes that are taking place, but I think it's important to begin here to really drive home the challenges that utilities and stakeholders are facing today. Traditionally, distribution systems have been built for one-way power flows. I think importantly, that has been the case for approximately 100 years in many jurisdictions. Utilities have been planning for centralized generators on the bulk power system to flow towards the distribution system. Today, the grid's changing. We have new tools and technology that are proliferating rapidly. We have the ability to locate distributed solar and storage on the distribution system, which changes the way the system operates fundamentally, from one-way power flows to two-way power flows to the ability to store energy in a distributed fashion. We've always had hydropower in some jurisdictions, but now we can take storage and put it anywhere on the power system, which changes the paradigm of planning to a significant degree. Another important change that we're experiencing is the digitizing of the distribution system and greater power system. And this comes through distribution automation, smart inverters, distribution sensors, and that enable monitoring throughout the power system. And all of this technology is creating enormous amounts of data that can be analyzed and used to more effectively operate and plan the system. Now, finally, there are many of these emerging issues are fundamentally changing customer demand. Utilities have thought of load as being very inelastic for a long time, and technologies enabling customers to have more elastic demand. Their demand's becoming more flexible in many cases, but people still need electricity, and it remains a necessity for many people. So there's different customer segments are rapidly evolving in different ways. All of these changes are creating a new energy paradigm with increased complexity and enormous potential. Most of these emerging technologies are new to the distribution system and utilities for the last decade or so. We didn't have smart inverters. We've had them for a while, but we're not utilizing them to their fullest extent. So they're still grappling with a lot of the technology that's going on onto the distribution system. For 100 years, utilities have not had to change their distribution system planning approaches significantly to accommodate these new technologies, EVs, generators, storage, and customer demand. So the question that we have to ask today is, with these technologies going on the system, how are Maryland utilities modifying their distribution system planning processes to accommodate these emerging issues? Better yet, how are Maryland utilities improving their distribution system plans to leverage the benefits created from these issues and these emerging technologies? If Maryland is like many states that I've had the pleasure of working in, that they don't really know the answer to these two questions. And that's because there's a lack of transparency with distribution system plans. And as we enter the new energy paradigm, we need a framework that can simplify the emerging complexities and increase transparency so that we can create value for customers at the distribution level. Ultimately, this is the purpose of distribution system planning. It's to effectively create value for customers. Distribution system planning is a framework for optimizing processes such as interconnection and forecasting that have become increasingly interdependent and require stakeholders and third parties to engage, to collaborate with utilities to create solutions. So the rest of the slides I'll be going through today are going to take us through, the OPC's framework for distribution system planning. Next, I'll touch on goals, and then we'll look at some more of the specifics around transparency and evaluation that the OPC would like to see. And then we'll go through some examples that show the interdependencies within distribution system planning. Look at how the distribution system planning process can help evaluate the utility business model and role. And then we'll talk about the more concrete benefits around market enablement and fostering competition. So distribution system planning goals. Maryland, like many states, is beginning to clean their power system with clean energy and targeting clean energy goals. Cleaning the grid is going to have numerous challenges, such as wholesale market reform, increasing demand for land uses, increasing engagement with customers to cost effectively integrate clean energy. And distribution system planning can be used to cost effectively site and integrate clean energy on the distribution system. As was touched on by staff, siting generation and storage near load has many advantages. And accelerating and maximizing this potential is going to be key to achieving Maryland state policy goals to clean its grid. To the slide's second point, and alluded in the previous slide, utilities have been planning the system largely the same way for 100 years. That logically creates inertia internally to the utility and within the regulatory framework. Distribution system planning provides a framework and a venue for both utilities, regulators, and wider stakeholder groups to work together to realize the potential created in the new energy paradigm. Maximizing the potential of all the technologies going onto the grid will require innovative thinking and evolution of the way utilities plan. Not only will utilities need to evolve, the regulatory framework will also have to evolve with it. Finally, for example, again, as touched on by staff, distribution system planning can be used to focus utility investments by connecting them to multi-year rate plans. Cost recovery requests and multi-year rate plans are often reviewed for prudence, magnitude, accounting practices. However, modern distribution system investments need to be deeply evaluated based on the functionalities that are being created and how those functionalities are being leveraged to drive value for customers. So essentially, when utilities bring forth significant distribution system investments, we need to identify the functionalities that are being enabled, and we need to tangibly see the benefits that are going to be created through those, whether it's through modified interconnection practices, modified rate designs. There's numerous connections that can be kind of drawn directly towards some of these significant investments, and they need to be linked to those investments. Finally, distribution system planning is a venue for advancing resiliency and improving reliability. Increased resilience and improved reliability can be an outcome enabled through comprehensive DER integration, but it won't happen organically. It will only happen efficiently through a thoughtful and comprehensive process that leverages the knowledge of numerous stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. So this slide goes over some of what are today's general practices within distribution system planning, and then adds on a future state that can be enabled through a more transparent distribution system planning process. So to be clear, today utilities do some form of distribution system planning. However, it is conducted within a black box outside of the regulatory space. Conducting the distribution system planning process outside of the regulatory space means that one of the utility's main cost drivers, i.e. the distribution system investments, receives little detailed review and scrutiny. And going back to really identifying functionality and how it's going to create benefit for customers. Traditionally, having distribution system planning conducted in a black box was potentially fine. Utilities were installing utility poles and wires, which created value to customers without the need for much utility innovation or action. It was really passively derived benefits, other through regular maintenance. And traditionally, data was relatively limited and was not utilized for insights that it can be today. As utility investments advance, data is becoming increasingly crucial to accurate planning, and data is used, and to use data to its fullest value, it should be shared and embedded with stakeholders. Try not to repeat what staff has discussed about forecasting, but it's a critical piece of distribution planning as well. And just the level of data that is being generated and the level of change that is occurring through transportation electrification, building electrification, all of these different loads that are being transformed are all now creating more and more data through different technologies and monitoring. And each of them leads to crucial assumptions within the distribution system planning process, and how large you're going to build the system and what investments are cost effective. And another issue that staff touched on is hosting capacity. Some utilities are discussing the option of preemptively upgrading distribution system capacity to allow additional DERs and load and export to interconnect. That would be the preemptive upgrade construct would be a significant change to the regulatory framework and would require a comprehensive and transparent approach to estimating and pricing hosting capacity. And that is a significant undertaking with numerous assumptions that need to be vetted by stakeholders. Lastly, the future state needs to explicitly consider DER alternatives, which the extent is unknown to which utilities in Maryland do so currently. So traditionally, wire solutions have been ingrained in the status quo, and processes are needed to develop procurement and programmatic structures to procure grid services from DERs. While integrating DERs may sound straightforward to some, it is a unique, it's unique because doing so crosses many of the silos that have been created within the distribution system planning process. Integrating DERs requires changes to interconnection, forecasting. It needs to be linked to major investments, and it can require processes to be changed outside of the distribution system planning, such as rate design and DER program structures. Next slide, please.
Before
So
you move on, hold on. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So I'm looking at your slide here and it says determine which grid needs can be met by DER or hybrid DER wire solutions. You see that box?
I do.
Okay. And who in your in your process makes that determination?
That would be determined through the distribution system planning process. A framework would need to be created to determine which grid needs can be met by DERs
So
or
I'm
wire
still
solutions.
confused. I'm still confused because you're still using the passive, and I'm trying to understand because utilities have a requirement. You know, they are required to provide reliable service, safe and reliable service. So the reliability is on the utility. And it sounds to me like you're saying that maybe that should no longer be on the utility, but be on some sort of process.
That's a good question, and I would not put reliability onto the third party. So I can give you some, the next two slides will go into some examples of a grid need that can be fulfilled by a DER. And I think maybe the need is where you're thinking of reliability. And I don't know it. That isn't really how I would articulate that.
Because I'm just trying to make sure I understand completely, because a grid need to me is maintaining the reliability of the grid. Now, maybe that's not what you meant, but maintaining the reliability of the grid is currently on the utility, and that is to suggest potentially that we change that. But I think I heard you're not suggesting that.
No, that isn't what I'm suggesting. The
Okay,
next two
all right.
examples will
Okay,
give
go
you some concrete examples of what I'm talking about with a grid need, right? On the distribution system, you have grid needs that are capacity related, potentially energy related. You need voltage regulation, and those types of needs can be provided by DERs. And the utility is still ultimately responsible for reliability. They just integrate the DER into their operational decision making.
Okay, keep going. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So here's an example of automated load management. So we've got numerous electric vehicles trying to interconnect to the grid. It's not really technically interconnection; it's done through a line extension policy. And the I'll just go through an example. So you have 10 EV chargers connecting to the grid. Each EV charger is 1 megawatt, creating a 10 megawatt need on the distribution system. Automated load management is essentially software that's used to lower the peak need from the grid, right? So when the facility that has a 10 megawatt demand goes to interconnect to the grid, the utility looks at that 10 megawatts and says, you're triggering a distribution upgrade at 8 megawatts. If you have an automated load management process with it allowed or permitted within the utility, that customer can use automated load management to lower its demand requirements to 8 megawatts. It will never need more than 8 megawatts now. It's using a software. It's not possible for that customer to import more than 8 megawatts. And it achieves that by throttling the EV chargers. So if all EV chargers are taken up and their customers are trying to draw the max capacity from all 10, it will never allow them to go over 8. And that just reduced the distribution system's need by 2 megawatts and relieved the need for an entire upgrade. And what that does is it utilizes distribution system capacity to a much larger degree, because instead of upgrading a circuit, you are now utilizing that circuit at a much higher level. So this is just one example of a process that can be created to for a DER to provide a service. And I will say that automated load management is not available in most jurisdictions right now, and it's an emerging topic that we're trying to create processes for that incentivize this very useful and cost-effective approach. And it's important, in my opinion, to front load approaches like this, because you have EVs proliferating so quickly that it could change the distribution system requirements pretty rapidly. So this is one example. Let's go to the next slide. So here, again, it's essentially, this is a dual service tariff. So a dual service tariff is usually made for large commercial customers and is now being applied to large energy storage systems. And for example, at FERC, and there's other jurisdictions that are looking at similar tariffs. Now, another example to just drive this home is you've got you've got a energy storage facility that's 10 megawatts connecting to the distribution system. It needs, again, the utility looks at its peak load requirement of 10 megawatts and says, you are going to trigger a system upgrade at 8 megawatts. That customer can say, under a dual service tariff, I only want 8 megawatts. I don't want to pay for the upgrade. And so they can take now 8 megawatts of peak capacity, even though the facility is 10. And they have 8 megawatts of firm, and then they can take as available above the 8 megawatts. So they can still charge at 10 megawatts sometimes. But the utility, when reliability is threatened, can now send a signal to the storage facility and say, you need to ramp down to 8 megawatts. You can no longer charge at 10. There is a constraint on the circuit you're on. You can no longer use that as available 2 megawatts. You need to go down to your firm amount of 8. And hopefully that gives you an example of a direct example of where it's not a reliability issue. It's actually helping reliability by creating flexible load on the circuit.
Mr. Nelson,
yeah, please.
Commissioner O'Donnell here. I want to ask you a question. So who, in your mind, who makes the decision to incorporate these technologies?
Great question. So this specific technology is basically some of your utilities might have it now. Basically, you need real-time substation data.
I'm not concerned about the specific technology. Who makes the decision to incorporate any technology in this part of your planning process? Who ultimately makes the decision?
That is a good question that might be jurisdiction specific. Traditionally, utilities are the ones that propose the investment and regulators approve or deny.
Okay. I think we're getting closer to the answer I'm looking for, which is related to Commissioner Herman's line of questions, which where does the ultimate responsibility lie and what is the role of the regulatory construct? But maybe we'll get there further in the presentation.
Yes, I would say that as far as this functionality goes and its relation to distribution system planning is as the functionality changes on the distribution system, you need to, number one, know what functionality is available. What are the utilities currently capable of? What are they going to propose and how are they going to leverage it? Just based on some of the language I've seen in the interconnection that's been used in the interconnection work group, this technology is currently available and potentially on the distribution already, distribution system already, but I could be wrong there.
Commissioner, if I could add on to that, this is Bill Fields. I think in this example, we're talking about the customer would make a decision about whether to have the storage facility, or in the other example, the EV charging. But for this kind of approach to happen, there would need to be a tariff for the utility that lays out basically the rules for how this would work, where a customer, where the utility has the ability to essentially dial down what the customer is using. A tariff would lay that out, say what the customer has to agree to, has to have the technical capability of to have that type of service, and then what the implications are going to be for for rates. And then that tariff, of course, would ultimately be be proposed by the utility, hopefully after discussion in this kind of a distribution planning process, and then ultimately approved by the commission.
That's helpful. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mr. Fields. This example is really supposed to show that to enable this tariff, you have to make modifications through the interconnection process. You need to understand what current functionalities exist on the distribution system, and then you have to create a rate design tariff to leverage the functionality that's on the system. All right, go to the next slide, please. So traditionally, utilities have had safety, reliability, and affordability right in their core services. Today, we're trying to achieve a lot of goals outside of those core services. And what regulators need is processes to evaluate how to achieve those goals that are outside what core goals the utilities had previously, and determine the most effective way to achieve them. You know, do we leverage third-party services to enable customer choice, innovation, environmental goals? Where does the utility fit? What services do they provide? And that is it's a complex question, and it requires a thoughtful process. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Josh Keeling, for the remainder of the presentation.
Thanks, Ron. Next slide. I think one thing that's critical here is to talk about the role of communities and stakeholders, customers, when we get into distribution system planning, because it's a dramatic evolution for a number of reasons. One of those is the fact that in many cases, communities and customers are the providers of solutions to the greater population. So some pocket of customers or some community where there may be a constraint has the ability to participate and provide solutions to the grid that then benefits all customers and all ratepayers. This requires a much higher level of engagement than seen even in traditional planning processes. This is why you see in distribution system planning frameworks that have started to roll out in states more formal engagement, education, and potential action planning processes taking place. So Oregon is a great example. Oregon's a few years into their integrated distribution system planning, and the utilities are actually required to create community action plans. And the reason for that is to identify key stakeholder groups who then can take on more technical knowledge and then have the tools to participate in the process. Transparency is, of course, really important. A lot of folks have talked about, the need for holistic solutions. A key foundation of that is having a common set of understanding of the economics and the technical requirements across the grid at a pretty detailed level. Common understanding is just critical in this process, both in terms of providing efficient solutions, but also in creating trust that is really critical for engagement of communities. It's also important that we consider community needs. When we start talking about locational deployment, there are often a lot of leveraging opportunities and a great deal of specificity needed in talking about benefits. Electricity is only becoming more important moving forward, both because of needs for resilience based on extreme weather events, but also with increasing electrification, the grid becomes that much more critical to ratepayers, and therefore an integrated set of solutions that considers all of these value streams is really important. But also, there's a great deal of funds coming in from a variety of parties, and when we start looking at locational deployment of assets, we have a tremendous potential to leverage other funding sources. And that is another reason that engagement is really critical, because municipalities, CBOs, state, federal funding coming in, integrated distribution planning is a great opportunity to find new funding streams. There's also a great opportunity to leverage the outreach and engagement into those communities from those organizations and stakeholders. Particularly when we look at things like non-wires alternatives, it is really important to understand the lay of the land, both from a technical perspective, resource potential perspective, but also who are the market actors, who are the stakeholders on the ground in those individual substations, feeders, nodes. It's really important. And the best source of that information is often the stakeholders and communities. Next slide, please.
Mr. Keeling?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Winston. On the slide you just had up.
Yeah.
Just a quick question regarding timing here. For some of the comments you have regarding engaging communities and transparency of data, are you suggesting that this type of back and forth between the community occurred during the work group process that's upcoming? Or is this something that occurs after the work group is finished and it's produced a result and the commission's taken some action?
It's never too soon to engage communities, though sometimes when you're at the early stages, it's hard for those communities to have grounding. So it really depends on the maturity of your stakeholders and how much they've been engaged so far in the process. What can be dangerous is sometimes I've seen states where stakeholders can get thrown into a very technical process without any grounding, and then they feel alienated. So it's really important that if they're going to be engaged at any stage of the process, that they're given the tools to be able to engage effectively and understand their role in that process. So I would say before even engaging in a work group, it's important to identify what is the appropriate role at a holistic level across all of the technical streams within a distribution system planning process, and then identify the tools that are required and start putting those forward. If you have stakeholder groups that have some grounding that you're comfortable engaging with, they can be really helpful allies in sort of developing that toolkit. So it can be a little bit specific to the situation.
So when you say engage communities, then you're not thinking about the general rate classes You're talking
No.
about advocacy organizations that are already active in the commission?
Usually that's the case. I think what's helpful is when you have some cross-cutting, like community-based organizations or advocacy groups that can speak more broadly. And then as solutions are developed, they have, specific community leaders that they can engage with as, say, we've identified a non-wires alternative that seems promising in this area, or we've prioritized this set of projects. We need to talk to folks in that community. Typically, the more cross-cutting organizations can be more helpful in sort of identifying those groups and sort of digging in.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of grid modernization and how that sort of fits in here, I think what's really helpful about integrated distribution system planning is that it provides us the tools to better assess some of these cross-cutting investments. I think AMI has been a great example of how difficult it can be to assess these foundational technical investments that touch on benefits across the entire system, from the wholesale to the distribution to retail to customer. But integrated distribution system planning gives us an opportunity to look at that, both in the near term and the long term, because often when we look at things like advanced distribution management systems, field area networks, just communications investments, which are getting particularly complex, DERMS, distributed energy resource management systems, it can be difficult to ascertain what their value is and whether it's a prudent investment or not. When we develop these common forecasting frameworks, we are able to start looking at the distribution system in the near term and in the long term and develop a shared vision of what the long-term distribution system needs to look like. That gives us a better idea of, okay, maybe the benefits are here today, but we expect them to be here tomorrow, and we've all kind of agreed to that. We have a common set of language to talk about that. That can be really helpful. There are some really nuanced questions that we need to ask in some of these grid modernization investments around where control lies, whether it's centralized, whether it's decentralized, whether third-party services providers are doing the controls versus the utility, whether the utility is monitoring or controlling at different levels. It's important that we have a sort of shared understanding of what the long-term system is going to look like. I think this is particularly true as we look at the advent of FERC 2222. Aggregators start participating more actively in the wholesale markets. There are specific responsibilities that the utilities have, but there's a lot of nuance that can be determined by the utility and its regulator at the state level, and so it's important to sort of think about those questions. Next slide, please. I think, when we think about the market benefits, as I sort of mentioned around 2222, this provides us both that and the great work that Neighbor Gnaziou did are starting to give us an idea of what are the core questions that we ask, and giving us an idea of some of the benefits that are very tangible that could be stacked in the near term. But there are still some really important questions to answer around to what degree customers have choice over technologies and services. The earlier questions by the commissioners around whether technology lives with the utility or with the customer or its service provider are really important. There's some fuzzy boundaries here when we look at DERs, DER dispatch controls, and how it relates to overall grid services. The utility has an obligation for reliability, but however, how it chooses to meet those obligations and how it chooses to engage third parties and customers is an open question that is evolving very rapidly. And I think having a common forum to talk about those questions and to what degree those services are contracted with third parties, handled through tariffs, or directly provided by the utilities is not an easy question, and probably is not a one size fits all. But it's important that we ask those questions. It's really important that we think about how to reduce barriers to provide seamless access to wholesale markets. With the advent of 2222, there are a lot of new processes that are going to need to take place. However, a lot of those can leverage existing investments. While there is a lot of new technology, there's a lot of great work that's already been done. A lot of the foundational work on hosting capacity analysis, for instance, provides a great framework for looking at things like aggregation review, and as distribution utilities start to look at assessing aggregations participating in wholesale markets. That will be helpful both in terms of wholesale market access for third-party aggregators, but also when considering aggregated DERs and non-wires alternatives. So taking this view of both, from centralized to decentralized to something in between is not easy, but there are a lot of tools already in place that can help to start to think about that stuff. And then I think it's really important to think about what the role is between procurement, tariffs, and programs. And that again is where distribution system planning can be really helpful. Next slide, please. That leads to sort of a really key goal, which is fostering competition. Third parties and competitive forces are going to take on very new roles going forward. Even absent distribution system planning, as I mentioned, the advent, the increasing importance of electricity to customers with electrification, with distributed technologies, with new sources of resilience and reliability in energy storage technologies, solar plus storage, are going to create a big role for third parties with or without distribution system planning. However, an integrated distribution system planning process allows us to leverage those resources to the benefit of all ratepayers as opposed to individual customers.
So this was a question I had for Mr. Lapp as well.
Yeah.
Really focused on competition, and I'm trying to figure out competition for what? Because we're talking here about distribution system planning. I'm assuming you don't want competitive distribution systems because obviously that would cost a lot of money. So competition for what?
Yeah, so the key here is leveraging competition to provide more efficiency in the provision of services. So
competition for what?
So
like what specifically are we competing? What are we trying to foster competition for? DER, storage? Give me some concrete example.
Sure. I think it's important to focus on outcomes, not on technologies. So non-wires alternatives is a great example. So there we're talking about the procurement of capacity relief, say within a feeder or substation, typically due to like thermal overloads or reverse power flows, something like that. In that case, the utility defines a service, and then that utility ideally leverages competition to procure those services at the most cost competitive price point to the benefit of all ratepayers.
So you're talking about something like a curtailment service? Is that something like that, a curtailment service?
It could be a curtailment service. It could be generation. Yes, but it could be dispatchable. It could be passive. I think that is the critical value of integrated distribution system planning, is to make sure that we all agree about how we define the services that the utility procures and the process by which it procures those services. Once that's done, then it's much more transparent in terms of how competitive forces can or cannot participate. It may be that there are certain services that through that process we determine that the most cost-effective means is for the utility to do it through a capital upgrade, and it may be that it's a third-party service. That can be very difficult, as Mr. Lapp pointed out, when we're dealing with a regulated monopoly versus third parties, and that's why it's really important to have an all-inclusive process that really brings in and thinks about these points explicitly. Very similar to what you see in, say, the regulated markets, where there aren't wholesale markets, where vertically integrated utilities, say procure energy or capacity for generation.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and this is where things get very tricky. So I mean, staff had mentioned, the overlap between, say, interconnection and planning. This comes up even in these procurement issues because in some cases, smarter and more thoughtful interconnection or tariffs can actually help to alleviate this as well. So providing price signals to retail customers with or without DERs can help to actually modify what we expect in terms of need in the first place. So making sure that there's that feedback loop and that we have the right balance between direct procurement versus tariffs versus programs is not an easy thing. And there isn't one right answer to that. It seems generally that the industry is moving towards an all of the above approach. But that's another thing to consider as well. Next slide, please. I think this is my last one. Some in terms of some benefits, I spent a lot of time talking about transparency of others, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that in the interest of time. I do want to talk about innovation a little bit. I think one thing that is a helpful lesson learned as we've thought about pilots and innovation, there's been a bit of pilot fatigue in a lot of states. I think the key thing and where we're seeing really success is where there's a more formal structure around how innovation is handled, and there's a clearer connection to regulation itself. So in the past, there have been a lot of utility pilots that were more independently sort of run by utilities just for the sake of technical innovation. However, what we see is that, and this whole process is a great example of this, is that there's a need for regulatory innovation. But of course, there needs to be protections and bounds around it. So a good example of where we're seeing this is, say, like in Connecticut, where Connecticut has a regulatory sandbox proceeding where they've defined specific rules under which a pilot can be proposed. And there's a lot of encouragement that those pilots are a collaboration between both the regulated utilities and third-party providers, and that those pilots have a structure around how their cost effectiveness is evaluated. However, they are allowed within bounds to identify key components of regulation that may be waived for a certain period of time, to sort of test the effect, or modified to test the impact of those changes. And then if success is determined out of that bounded process, that is then fed back to a broader stakeholder group and to the commission to consider potential modifications to rulemaking. That's really helpful for making sure that pilots that are ineffective are shut down quickly, but pilots that are effective are given the tools to scale effectively. And then, really having a view on the lowering of long-term costs, having a view towards the near-term and long-term. There's a lot of quick wins. There's a lot of things that can happen now, but it's really important that we have a view that considers what can happen now while also being flexible and considering what the longer-term value is. It's not an either or, but there's some nuanced decision-making that it really needs to take place to consider a balance between the short-term and the long-term. And I think that's all I have. Thank you all for the time. I really appreciate it.
Mr. Keeling, I have a question for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on behalf of OPC, your firm has talked a lot about competitive forces and competition being an important and integral part of reforming our distribution system planning processes. And you mentioned FERC Order 2222 several times.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Well, you don't mention anything on a distribution level similar to FERC Order 1000, which requires in the transmission system competitive forces. Does your firm or does OPC envision a FERC 1000 kind of construct at the state level for Maryland?
I'll let OPC speak to some of that. I will just say that that's a great question. there has been a lot of conversation broadly in the industry with the advent of FERC 2222 around open access distribution tariffs, and just sort of more outcome-based tariffs that sort of symmetrically treat both load and DERs. There's a question about whether that has to go as far as like an OAT, but I think a general trend in that direction makes a lot of sense, and we're seeing a lot of traction moving in that direction. Things like flexible interconnection, which we talked a little bit about, are sort of an intermediate step towards that.
OPC?
Yeah, Commissioner O'Donnell, I'll let Bill Fields speak to this more specifically, but certainly we think that should be part of what is considered in the distribution planning process. It's about identifying those functions that have to be served by the utility and making sure that they are performed in a competitively neutral way and that they are effectively regulated and that they facilitate effective competition for the products and services that can and should be subject to competition. I don't know, Bill, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just add that I think our thinking is that we'd be best served by taking a step-by-step approach to this, incorporating, working on incorporating the DERs, non-wireless alternatives, more advanced type solutions. I think is something that we need to all keep thinking about and working on to see if it really would be to the benefit of customers ultimately.
I'll just remind everybody that FERC 1000 didn't translate very well into the theory didn't translate well to practice. Just saying. I don't know anybody that would argue that it did.
I would echo those concerns. I think some of the best laid intentions by injecting competition into the wholesale transmission development market more than 10 years ago now have just backfired and effectively failed, and we've seen very little transmission on the wholesale transmission system. I would hate to see something similar on the distribution side as well. So I think it is important, this planning. I think what Mr. Keeling said at the outset, that this is sort of a dramatic and exciting opportunity to open up the distribution system planning process. By the same token, the utilities who have held this planning process close to the vest have done so, I think we've heard, for the better part of 100 years. At the end of the day, this commission regulates and holds these utilities accountable when things go wrong, when the distribution system isn't properly planned. I ask OPC and the consultants here, who do we hold accountable? Because right now we have lots of varied interests at the table, and I suspect we'll have a lot of different voices and perspectives over the next year. But when something happens or there's some widespread outage, I suspect many of those folks at the distribution system work group table will not be subject to accountability or penalties by this commission. And the only entity left at the table is the utility. Can you help me there? How do we discipline the process if we can't, let's say, hold this nonprofit available, but they've had their fingerprints on whatever the utility ultimately incorporates into the plan, whether it be DER or storage, and we could trace it back to this nonprofit group or the state energy office or the residential ratepayer advocate. But none of those entities we have any sort of jurisdiction over. So can you help me out there?
I think I could take a crack at that, and then my colleagues can jump in where I come up short. Just to still piggyback on the competition discussion earlier, a distribution system planning process will foster competition, but that's not the only pathway towards creating benefits for customers. You're still going to be creating benefits through programs, through structured competitive procurements that have rules and penalties, clear penalties. They're
Right,
contracts.
Mr. Nelson, right. Okay, so there'll be rules and penalties, but penalties against whom?
They don't.
The providers, the DER providers.
But does this commission
For
have,
like a non-wires solutions contract, they would be required to provide a well-defined service. And if they don't provide that service, they have to pay a penalty.
Yeah,
right, let me stop you though. Who do they pay the penalty to, and who are they subject to the regulation by?
so this is no different than what happens today. Say, if you were to build a substation. So if you were to build a substation, there's a competitive process by which an EPC is selected. That EPC is going to be a third party in a lot of cases. It may or may like there's going to be some competitive component to that, even if it's just simply the hardware. And they will have some pass-through penalties for the reliability of their component that will be well defined within contract. And that's no different here. So ultimately, the utility is responsible for reliability, and they may have pass-through penalties that happen to their service providers that take place.
But
So
Mr. Keeling, if Baltimore Gas Electric builds a substation and they use contractors, there is a privity of contract between the contractor and BGE. If there's a defect, but this commission has no ability to levy a penalty on the contractor. We would levy a penalty on BGE for failure of its equipment to serve customers. So, is there
and
anything?
you would presumably define the rules by which they are levied penalties, and then they will determine how to pass those penalties through or not to their service providers. And that would be a similar situation here with a non-wires alternative or something of the like.
I would just add that OPC isn't suggesting competition for competition's sake. The ultimate goal here is performance for customers. And so it requires taking a step back and identifying what is going to get the best performance for customers. Now, there may be a situation or situations identified by the distribution planning group where the commission may not have the jurisdiction that it needs to ensure that either competition or regulation performs effectively for customers, in which case it may need to make recommendations to the legislature. But that doesn't mean that it should not determine what produces the best performance for customers.
Thank you, Mr. Lapp. Are there any other questions from commissioners? Seeing none, thank you to OPC and to their consultants. We'll next turn to the presentation from the Maryland Energy Administration, which is the state's energy office.
Sorry, having some difficulty bringing up slides.
Dr. Opsel, there you go. Sound check.
Yes, can you hear me?
We could hear you fine.
I'm trying to bring up the slides, but all right, so apparently I don't have the permissions available on WebEx to bring up the slideshow, so I can just go ahead and go without the slides. I believe the commission.
Okay, Dr. Opsel, we might be able to help you out there. Let's, if the host advisor could transfer privileges. There we go.
Thank you. All right. I have my technical difficulty out of the way. All right, well, thank you. Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. I'm Ryan Opsel, Policy Director with the Maryland Energy Administration. And thank you for the opportunity today to briefly discuss the Distribution Planning Working Group. And of course, the intent of MEA and the other stakeholders in this process. We're happy to continue to be a part of PSC's multi-year transformative PC44 process, which does continue to put Maryland ahead of other states in the adoption of new technology and regulatory structures for the electric grid. If I could have the next slide. For those that may be new to this particular stakeholder process, Maryland Energy Administration is Maryland State Energy Office. We have both a policy component and a programmatic component, providing grant, loan, and tax relief funding for some of the actual enhanced grid technologies that will most likely be further along as a result of deliberations in this working group. And it's things like funding for residential solar, battery systems, and energy efficiency. Next slide. So this is really the result, right, of the 2-year neighborhood Ignazio process, which was really a thorough and deliberate attempt to explore many of the different options and approaches available to improving the distribution planning process. Combination of both Public Service Commission and State Energy Office staff from multiple states brought in a lot of different perspectives and goals for what such a revised process could actually look like. And some of these potential outcomes are demonstrated on this slide here. So I plucked this particular diagram from the Neighbor Ignazio main report, just to kind of demonstrate this range of options and outcomes that were explored by participants. I would encourage participants in this working group to keep in mind this important range of outcomes. There are a lot of beneficial options available to our respective ratepayers, grids, and state policy that can come from a revised distribution planning process, and we should strive to explore many of them. We've certainly heard many great ideas from both OPC and staff today, and we look forward to exploring those through this working group process as well. The obvious environmental and carbon emission reduction benefits are one set of benefits that were explored and could potentially result from engaging in a more revised and transparent process. As listed here by the other state participants, increasing system efficiency, targeting resilience through critical energy infrastructure investments, along with the preservation of the core safety, reliability, and affordability foundations of the grid and more, are all items that can be potentially addressed with this working group. Next slide. So the Neighbor Ignazio meetings ultimately culminated in the final report, and our particular state ended up in the Jade cohort, and this was the roadmap that we ultimately ended up with. What I would want participants to note in this is first the complexity of the process and the need for multiple checks and ideal stakeholder input along the way. Additionally, we should recognize the need for increased transparency and data availability if stakeholders are to play any sort of serious role in this process. So many stakeholders are really unable to engage in at this moment. In the map laid out here, participants generated several points for potential stakeholder engagement, metric standardization, data availability, and the addition of useful tools to this process, like the increased availability of up-to-date hosting capacity analysis maps and locational value assessments. The point here is that there are many potential touch points for various stakeholders throughout this process and different tools available that can assist and potentially enhance system planning. Next slide. All right, so in these particular proceedings, MEA is seeking a few different things. First, we would like to point out and underscore that we do recognize the position of the respective utilities as the ultimate providers of grid safety and reliability. Now, the engineers of these respective utilities know their systems better than anyone. We don't believe this working group process should interfere with those responsibilities. We also recognize that some data may not be openly available and will need to remain confidential for either business or security concerns, or when it comes to personally identifiable information. Now, for transparency, despite the utilities will retain that decision-making authority on the safety and security of their respective systems, a key goal for MEA and the working group is still to increase the transparency surrounding that decision-making process that goes into distribution system planning. This remains a relatively opaque process and is not necessarily conducive to an approach that is responsive to state policy aspirations and the changing generation mix. So this would certainly be a chief aim of this process. And now the locational value study. This is something that we focused on in our filing last year. We do believe that such a study, if conducted, perhaps on a regular basis, could bring several benefits to Maryland's grid, answering some key questions regarding potential grid needs. What this process generally would entail is the siting of infrastructure to improve grid resilience on a technical basis, and not just on an avoided cost basis. And by that meaning the identification of physical locations where infrastructure replacement, improvement, or installation would best benefit grid efficiency, integrity, and resilience, and not create detrimental environmental or socioeconomic impacts. Some of the questions we would hope to be answered through such a study would include things like where we could add a battery system or a CHP system or energy efficiency improvements in order to actually increase system reliability, with the end goal of perhaps improving certain reliability and resiliency metrics, and whether we could do that system-wide or by looking at individual feeders. Another potential way of approaching this is focusing where grid congestion is higher more generally, perhaps even looking at elevated LNP prices. We certainly know of certain congested corridors, especially resulting from densely populated areas and higher load. Adding additional distributed generation to these areas may reduce the amount of transmission capacity needed to carry the necessary energy from outside these areas, and can instead help to relieve these constraints internally. Targeting these particular areas over time could have multiple benefits, including increased reliability, cleaner generation, and lower prices. It will be necessary to have the utility to identify these areas of the grid that need reliability improvements, making it so the replacement of a system confers net benefits to the grid instead of just potentially benefiting developers and individual households. Next slide. Stakeholder input has come up time and again. Expanding stakeholder input would be a key component of what we would be after in this working group session. As pointed out in the Neighbor-Gnazio roadmap, that would include potentially multiple junctures along the distribution planning process. This would be the inclusion of state agencies and more traditional stakeholders with a stake in the planning process, but also less traditional stakeholders that may be directly impacted by utility infrastructure build-outs. As part of this more open process, understanding why certain infrastructure investments are chosen over others, and input into that process, not only through general stakeholder input, but potentially input to the cost-benefit analysis used to determine preferred investments, would be something that we could investigate as well. Drive here is to make sure that less traditional investments, namely other non-wires alternatives, distributed generation, and others are fully and properly considered alongside more traditional infrastructure investments. Ideally, determining a way to price in resiliency to these sorts of investments would occur as well. Next, active roles for community leaders. This is certainly connected to stakeholder input, but I wanted to expand on it a little bit. We also think this process can provide an active role for interested community leaders in the DSP process on projects that directly affect their communities to ensure their needs are met, and that the solutions proposed do not create adverse impacts, especially to communities that have historically experienced socioeconomic and environmental vulnerabilities and disadvantages. Think impacts from infrastructure siting, environmental impacts, costs, etc. Although an example like this does not yet exist directly for distribution planning, an idea for a model of sorts could be the Baltimore City Community Resiliency Hub program, some projects which were partially funded through the MEA Resiliency Hub grant program. The city is creating a network of resiliency hubs across Baltimore's most vulnerable and disadvantaged communities to create safe local locations for residents to congregate during grid outage events. While not full-scale emergency shelters, resiliency hubs provide emergency power for charging phones and computers, running portable medical equipment like dialysis and CPAP machines, refrigeration for temperature-sensitive medications, and an air-conditioned space to keep residents in safe and healthy temperatures. The city's developer works directly with trusted community locations that agree to become these hubs and actively involves them in the process of designing hubs for their facilities. The theory behind this is that a location such as a church, library, or community center already has established trust of the community, understands the needs of the residents. They can bring these needs and community perspectives directly into the planning process so that the most beneficial system is designed at the right location that responds effectively to the community, and it's a direct increase in equity. This type of involvement needs to be part of the DSP. Communities where infrastructure is to be sited or locations which are disproportionately affected by an underperforming grid must be involved in the planning process to implement improvements so the outcome is equitable to all load pockets. Involvement should not necessarily just be observation, should be some sort of direct contribution to this process. And finally, the last one there for state and federal funding. This is especially dependent on federal funding. This working group could also potentially provide a forum for many stakeholders to discuss how to best use those federal funds and thinking money that's coming down from the recently passed infrastructure package or any other federal legislation that is ultimately passed. So to wrap up, MEA believes that this is really a worthwhile and necessary process for us all to engage in. And true to past PSC, PC44 working groups, I think we'll certainly be able to accomplish a great deal. But also we will all be learning a great deal about this process and adapting to it as it unfolds. This is a complex yet high impact system, local communities and households, and it directly impacts state policy considerations. We look forward to working on this and moving toward a better, cleaner, more reliable and cost-effective grid. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Opsahl. I think you just summed it up in those last 10 words of your presentation there, and appreciate the partnership of our State Energy Office. Commissioners have some questions. We'll begin with Commissioner Herman.
Thank you. Mr. Opsahl, question I have for you is, do you think that the working group has a common and consistent definition of non-wires alternatives? And if it does, what is it?
I would suggest it does not. And I would think that when we're talking about potential non-wires alternatives that could be placed in certain locations around the grid, I think that the working group would need to establish a definition for that. I would think that would be the best approach, Commissioner.
Okay, thanks, because I'm a little confused because I have a suspicion that, as you said, it may not be consistent across everybody. It may be more expansive in some participants' minds than others. And it seems that everybody, all of the presentations talk about non-wires alternatives, but I'm not sure they're all talking about the same thing. So it's I'll say for my part, it causes a bit of confusion. So I hope that the working group can potentially discuss that, because I think that's going to be a very, we hear that a lot, and I think that's going to be a really important term. And I think we need some, hopefully, consistency and agreement among the parties.
Yeah.
So thanks.
Yeah, Commissioner, I absolutely agree. And I imagine that we are going to be working on a lot of definitions during this working group process and really, determining what is possible, what can be done, what can't be done. I really do believe that this process is going to be probably a learning experience for all stakeholders that are involved. And I wouldn't want to suggest what the correct definition for us and for the state right now is for non-wires alternatives. But I do think that the working group is probably a good place to try and at least come up with a set definition for something like that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just to follow up, Dr. Opsahl, and to the broader stakeholders and work group participants, when developing definition for non-wire alternatives, I would encourage you to keep the door open for technological developments, as OPC talked about. You don't want to circumscribe it in such a way that you have to come back to the drawing board every time a new technology becomes available. So I agree definition should be developed, but it shouldn't be one that's constricting.
I agree as well, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you again to the Maryland Energy Administration. Our final presenter today is a group of environmental advocates led by Earth Justice. We're now at noon. We do need to wrap up by about 12:30 this afternoon. So I'll turn over the floor to Dr. Rabago and Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman and Commissioners, and good afternoon. We would also like to thank you for inviting us to participate in this important conversation. Mr. Rabago is our consultant and our expert witness. He has participated in PC 44 since its inception. He has 25 years of experience in the electric utility industry, including as a commissioner with the Public Utility Commission of Texas, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Utility Technologies at the Department of Energy, as VP of Distributed Energy Services for Austin Electric Company, and as Executive Director of PACE Energy and Climate Center. So I would now like to turn it over to Mr. Rabago so I don't take up any more of his time.
Great, thanks, Susan. And Molly, you, look at that, how good this technology is working. All the bugs were worked out by everyone else. Thank you, commissioners, stakeholders, staff, everyone for putting together this amazing educational series and letting us be a part of it. I'm going to offer you a slightly different perspective, perhaps another alternative framing for some of the work that you have to do. I draw on two great sayings by two great philosophers, Lewis Carroll, who said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And of course, Yogi Berra, who said, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else. So in this, I want to bring you to thinking about where your mental furniture is sitting, what pre-existing mindset you have towards solving resource requirements for ensuring safe, reliable, cost-effective grid services. And our existing mindset, if you've been around this industry very long, is generally that bigger things are cheaper. Bigger things, and even that bigger things are less expensive and that they cost less. Of course, cost, price, value, those are all very different terms and they have to be looked at very carefully. But we assume, because economies of plant scale were a big part of utility economics last century, that they continue to be the major driver of utility economics today. And that is changing. Taking a systems perspective and using the lessons we've learned from the application of distributed energy resource solutions, we're increasingly learning that sometimes smaller solutions are not only worth more, but actually cost less. And there are a number of factors causing this to happen, but we have tested this in millions, literally millions of individual DER applications across this country and around the world. We know that in the one-off situation, DERs can have high value. But until recently, we have not had the ability to understand whether lots of DERs could actually provide resource value to the entire utility system. And that's simply because we couldn't plan, we couldn't model, because our computer models couldn't give us the insights we needed. What I'm going to do with this presentation is show you what happens when new, more powerful models that can both see the entire utility system and dynamically assess resources down to the granular scale. I'm talking 1 kilowatt, 3 square kilometers, and 5 minutes, tell us about the value of distributed energy resources in meeting the need for electricity services. This is a story about what we can learn if we use more powerful tools. It confirms prior learning. As I said, it opens new horizons for your efforts in distribution system planning. It tells you where you could be going. It tells you where the best place to start is, and that's with DSPs that try to achieve the deployment of resources that could provide the least cost solution. So let's get started. and I'll run you through just a few slides. The context for this is a question we ask some modeling tools that we have been working with, and I say we, a local solar for all coalition that involves the Coalition for Community Solar Access, Vote Solar, some companies like Sunrun, a number of others. We asked them, how do we build a grid for the lower 48 states that achieves clean energy goals at the lowest cost? So we looked at the entire non-Alaska and Hawaii continental United States, and we gave our new, more powerful model the goal of 80% clean electricity and 50% economy-wide reductions by 2030. We also ask it to deliver 95% economy-wide reductions of carbon dioxide and 100% economy-wide electrification by 2050. This is the exercise, and this is what it told us. So let's go to the next slide, and I will show you what we learned. What we learned is that if you set up ambitious goals like that 80% clean electricity goal by 2030, you have to build out across the country 103 gigawatts of distributed solar and 137 gigawatts of distributed storage. Using that DER enables, and this is one of the most powerful things we learned, enables 579 gigawatts and 442 gigawatts of solar and 442 gigawatts of wind. And by the way, I'm giving you the US picture because we haven't done the study just for Maryland yet. We've done the study for California, we've done it for Illinois, we've done it for New York, and we're capable of doing it for Maryland. But when you do this study on a nationwide basis, if you take this approach with distributed energy resources, the nation could save $109 billion on electricity costs by 2030. The smaller solutions, if aggressively deployed, actually reduce the cost of providing electricity service and create an incremental 1.2 million local solar and storage jobs in this country just by the end of the decade. If you take those savings and those resource deployments and you direct them towards low and moderate income households, you could reduce the energy burden for 8 to 15 million households across the country. These results are nothing new, it turns out. They're the same kind of results we're seeing from the Department of Energy Solar Future Study, from local solar roadmaps that we've developed at the Local Solar for All Coalition, and in other studies, including, by the way, a recent study from the National Renewable Energy Lab. Next slide.
Mr. Rabago, before
Yes.
you go on, I
Yes,
got a question for you. How do you define clean electricity?
Okay, in this case, these are resources that do not emit carbon dioxide, because one of the modeling criteria is we wanted to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions, get that 80% reduction and then do that, and then get the 100% reduction by 2050. So carbon dioxide emissions are the criteria for this one.
Okay, so nuclear would be considered a producer of clean electricity.
Nuclear energy is certainly an option in this modeling. It has to compete on an economic basis, just like every resource.
Right. So just like every resource, that's right. There's a lot of heavy subsidization out there, though. A lot of different sources.
Yes, sir. There's some background noise on the economics of every resource. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rabago?
Yep. Yes.
Just one other quick question. You on the same slide for the 1.2 million local solar and storage jobs. Are these permanent positions, or are these installation or install, and then folks are back on the market looking for a new job?
I think a lot of these are going to be installation related jobs. I don't have a resolution in the modeling of whether they're permanent or not. What this is a sort of an econometric output of the analysis, which uses just like the sort of the conventional economic development models do, where you use a multiplier per unit of spending and then have factors for different technologies. So what this is really showing is that a strong emphasis on distributed resources incrementally creates more jobs because distributed resources are more labor intensive. But it doesn't tell you how long and how permanent, where they are and how permanent they are. They're assumed to be in the area where the resources are installed. I'll take a slight switch and save some money later to tell you that we specifically overlaid our economically disadvantaged communities map in New York with this fine resolution of where these resources go and assumed the jobs there, and found a really nice coincidence between where the jobs could go, where the resources are deployed, and the regions of the state of New York that have been identified as economically disadvantaged. So there's opportunity to fine tune it, but I don't have the resolution on the question that you're asking.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. So let's get into why this modeling is different and why we can produce different results. Next slide. Thank you. The first thing you need to understand is how our current utility system models work. They were built at a time when computing power was scarce and had to be hoarded, and where, to be honest with you, the safe presumption was that in most cases, large-scale solutions were the best scale solutions. So the models would blow up if you tried to dynamically assess distributed resources. So we just didn't do it. That's still the case in Aurora, Strategist, ProMod, ProScreen, Plexus, all the conventional large-scale models. We had limited data sets, we had limited computing power, we didn't really think we needed to look at those distributed resources, and we certainly didn't model with outputs that included things like reducing or eliminating carbon or maximizing reducing or eliminating carbon or electrifying the entire economy. We always model for a least cost. It's the prime directive in utility modeling, and the model we used to produce this study does the same thing. But we just couldn't look past that line and really dynamically model those distributed resources until, next slide. The next slide tells you about a model we use from a company called Vibrant Clean Energy called the Wisdom model. It was a model that was originally built for weather forecasting. It thrives in a big data environment. So we brought that huge computing power to the utility system for the first time that we know anywhere, and asked the model to open that barrier to dynamically select distributed resources as appropriate, to use that resolution, 5 minutes, 1 kilowatt, 3 square kilometers, and that computing power to find the true least cost solution, to consider flows of electricity both downhill from utility scale resources to load and distribution resources, but also uphill for ways for the distribution system could support the utility scale system. And we told the model to optimize local clean energy integration and optimization. Lots more on the model that is available, but that's the introduction. That's what makes it more powerful. We go to the next slide, and as in any modeling exercise, I lay out for you the criteria. I already went through a lot of this. The goals are achieve these first 4 bullets, if you will, the clean electricity and economy-wide carbon reductions in 2030 and in 2050. And then for comparison and contrast, we basically, in one, we said, optimize the distributed energy resources and use local solar and storage as resources. And in the other, even though it's artificial, in order to understand whether distributed resources really are more expensive, as our conventional wisdom told us, or could be less expensive, as all those exercises have taught us, we said stop the build out of distributed energy resources past 2021. So very stark contrast. If the big stuff really is cheaper, the constrained DER model should have the least cost. If the distributed stuff can reduce system costs, then it should show it should show that by optimizing distributed energy resources. Next slide shows you what we put into it and what came out. So we start with projected levels of 2021 distributed PV, which includes both front of the meter community scale and rooftop, all be lower, interconnected at 69 kV or lower. And what happened to distributed energy, distributed storage, which is practically zero in 2020, but has to grow dramatically under this modeling. So the model says, give me more of the local stuff. And if you give me more, I can save you money. The next slide shows how those savings occur. They start from day one and they continue throughout the planning and assessment period, meaning there's none of this sort of lag before you get the benefits. Distributed resources saved from day one. How does this happen? The next two slides, I'm going to tell you why distributed resources can save money. The first way is by smoothing the load. If you look at the top with utility-only resources and assess this slice of hours during the summer, you basically see that the distribution demand on the right, which varies, has to be followed by utility scale resources. Following varying load costs money. It's what drives the costs of the utility system. So plants going up and down, resources that only serve during peak period, all that stuff costs money. If you can use your distributed resources to smooth the effective load that the system sees, the utility scale system saves a lot of money. So the first way in which using distributed resources saves you money is by smoothing the load. This is manufacturing 101, right? If you could make the same product at the same rate 24/7, 365, your factory will be more efficient than if you have to constantly change your output and production rates. The second way is the next slide. The next slide is a geek's paradise for me. I got to cooperate in the production of a study way back 20 years ago from Rocky Mountain Institute called Small is Profitable. We use the load duration curve as a starting issue that had to be addressed by distributed resources. And we all know that the top of this colored space on this chart is what utility load looks like. We know that it's expensive because less than 10% of the time do we use 80%, maybe even 70% of the top of the system, right? So we build because we need electricity all the time, that's reliability, but we don't use all our resources all the time and on a uniform basis. Distributed resources reshape the load that the utility system needs. And they do that not just by attacking the peak. Everybody knows we got to attack the peak. It's a big part of those non-wire solutions that have been talked about already this morning. But because distributed resources change the load that the utility system sees, they create savings across 80% of the hours in the year. So this graph shows you 100% of the hours in the year across the horizontal and the amount of demand that the utility system sees in the vertical. And the light blue is what optimizing distributed energy resources can do to your total resource cost. Bonus, they even fill in that little bit at the very tail. A flatter load duration curve saves money. In this case, $110 billion about out to 2030 for the lower continental United States. Next slide shows you what this looks like for the utility system for the lower 48. Not much different. You start with current existing resource mix in 2020 on the far left, and you look at the difference between using utility scale resources only in 2021 after, or in optimizing your local solar and storage. You add diversity to the system, which everyone knows for ecosystems is good in times of resource constraint. That diversity appears as distributed energy storage and distributed solar photovoltaics, as well as still relying on the other resources and growing them significantly from the current status quo. It's that change at the top that makes the difference that I just showed you and ultimately generates all those savings. The job performance is the next slide. We already talked about it. It's an econometric calculation. One thing I want to emphasize about the jobs is that this is not part of the 109 billion. This is a multiplier and an adder, but we didn't do any job valuation to get to that 109 billion. The 109 billion is utility resource cost only. And by the way, that 109 billion assumes that all customers pay all the cost of all the resources. If you can stimulate any private investment in those resources, you save additional money in the total cost of utility electricity. So just summing up on the next slide, what did we learn from this exercise and what could we learn by applying this modeling on other state basis or in other ways? If you go to the next slide for me, the key takeaways here, actually go back one, I'm sorry, we skipped, I hope. We should have one. Do we have? Oh no, sorry. Go to the next one. I'm sorry. I got it out of order. There we go. So the previous slide just is the same slide I showed you at the start with the big takeaway numbers. These are the big takeaway concepts. We already know that solar and storage are increasingly popular and perhaps the most charismatic electricity resources we've ever had. We already know they have benefits, as Mr. Borowski said, at the very start, significant benefits that can be brought to the grid. We know that those are benefits not just to customers, not just to the grid, but to society in general. What we now know with this modeling is that we can reduce costs for everyone by increasing the amount of distributed energy resources that are used in the grid. We now know this is not the time to slow the pedal. You know, take your foot off the pedal on moving forward with these resources, that we have to accelerate their growth. What else can we do? Well, as Commissioner Litton pointed out with his question, one of the things we can do is think real hard about how jobs are created by this, where these resources go, and start advancing our energy justice goals with our planning as well. We know we can get an insurance policy on big transmission investments by addressing distributed energy resources. We know we'll get an improvement in resilience and can get an improvement in reliability as well, more jobs, and we can address our climate goals even faster. So there's a huge opportunity here. We just have to rearrange our mental furniture a little and take advantage of the resources that are showing up at the distribution edge of the system. Okay, I went through it about as fast as I think I can do it. The last slide just shows contact information, but of course you can go through Susan Miller or me, or staff knows where I live, if I can help you in anything else. And I'll stand for your questions.
Mr. Robago, thank you. Thank you for holding to time, but more importantly, thank you for a very interesting, thought-provoking presentation here. It draws from your experience as a regulator and an academic. I do appreciate that. I don't have any questions. I know we will have all of these presentations provided to us if we have additional questions, so I'll turn to my colleagues if they have any. Okay, seeing none. Thank you.
Let me take advantage of just one more minute then. You mentioned the regulator thing, and when I got into modeling these exercises, that's the hat I put on to look at these results. So I'll leave you with 3 takeaways that sort of came out of the old once upon a time was a regulator thinking about what these results mean. The first result is this. There's an awful lot of artificial tension between distributed and utility scale resources these days, and it is frustrating when you have to be a decision maker. Oftentimes, regulators find themselves in the middle. So do legislators, by the way. And it's never fun to be in the middle of two good things. Good things like utilities making their systems more diverse and adding renewable resources at the utility scale, and the opportunity that the distributed resources show us. I want to stress again, this modeling shows that's a false choice. You need both, and they mutually complement each other. Our studies in California show that storage shuttles electricity between distributed storage and utility scale storages to optimize benefits. So the first thing is that's good about taking advantage of distributed resources is you get out of that trap, if you will. The second thing is that I've looked at dozens, if not more, utility resource plans over my 30 years in the business here. It blows me away how many billions, if not trillions of dollars of resources we plan for based on the output from a single model used and selected by a single party. The opportunity presented by this new modeling tool is to add diversity. Put it another way, you never decide return on equity based on the output from one analyst's chosen model. No commissioner would do that. It would constrain your discretion artificially. We should be looking at this problem and these challenges and opportunities as many ways as we can to find the best fit in the public interest. And then third, the savings that this kind of analysis shows are available don't just have to be applied to one thing or the other. They can be reinvested. They can be reinvested in particular outputs and outcomes that you want for your state or that your policymakers have told you are top priorities for Maryland. And in that regard, this is a pretty cool thing for a regulator to have in their tool bag, and I encourage you to explore it. Thanks for letting me go on a little bit more. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to continuing this process.
Thank you, and that we will over the course of the next year. So in closing today, I think we all found this to be a very productive use of our time. This is the fourth and final informational session that the Commission will be hosting with respect to the distribution system planning efforts going forward. At this point, with the work group now underway under the leadership of Stephanie, the parties will meet, I understand, more regularly, culminating with a report due to the Commission in December of 2022. Of course, there will be waypoints where the commissioners will meet if necessary and provide additional input to the work group. But I do wish the work group well over the course of the next 12 months. At this point, the commissioners are going to depart, but the conversation between the interested parties and work group membership will continue after about a 10-minute break. So if the parties that wish to stay, just stay in this live stream room. We'll reconvene at 12:40 p.m. Eastern without the commissioners present. Again, thank you for your participation. We are now off the record.
For those who are staying in the room, go ahead and, take a break, maybe get some food. We'll reconvene at 12:40. I'm going to end the live stream at that point. So if you are on the live stream and you'd like to join the rest of the discussion, please follow the link that's on the screen. I'm going to leave it up for another minute or so, and then I'll turn that off. Thanks, everyone.